Sí. Hola, hola, hola. Sí.
Used to think I had it alright. How I lived was how I should. I never took the time to lay my heart on the line. Ooh, 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 straight, but so far off in that line. I never listened to the words that were written in your songs. I never wanna let you down. I never wanna let you go. In time, always running around. If you wanna go. Let's go. Say people go. This particular time is extra special. And though you might be gone, and the world may not know, celestial. Like a lion you ran, a goddess you rode. Like an eagle you circle, in perfect purple. So how come things move on? How come cars don't slow? When it feels like the end of my world. Wanna shoot but I can't let you go. But when I'm there's a light that you give me when I'm your shadow. There's a feeling you give me, it never goes. Like brothers in blood, sisters who ride, and we swore on a night, be friends who we die. With the changing of winds and the way water flows, life is short as the falling snow. And now I'm gonna miss you, I know. But when I'm if you love someone, you should let them know. All the light that you left me will never go.
Shaking, you got me craving your love, your love. You got me needing, you got me breathing your love, your love. And lately you've been far away, telling me you don't wanna stay. You drive me crazy, but I'll follow you. My feet, they carry me any place that you may be. I just want you to see that I follow you back home. You got me crazy, you got me chasing your love, your love. You got me seeking, you got me drinking your love, your love. And lately you've been far away, telling me you don't wanna stay.
vois plus la fin, je veux sentir tes yeux sur les miennes. Il y a tout ce temps, on va passer. Pourtant j'ai peur de t'avouer que à chaque fois que je te vois, je réalise comme j'ai besoin de toi. Je t'aime et je te hais, je déteste t'aimer. Je ne veux pas, mais je ne sais pas aimer un autre que toi. Je t'aime et je te hais, je déteste t'aimer. Tu la trouves si belle, mais je ne serai jamais elle. Tu me manques et je ne dors pas, juste après un café quand je ne peux plus manger. Tu manques et tu n'es pas là. Je me souviens de ces nuits blanches où l'on rêvait. Penses-tu qu'on se manque autant? Où que j'aille, je te vois pourtant. Les amis se font mal parfois. Et je suis fatigué, mais jamais de toi. Je pourrais tout faire pour toi, mais ça, tu t'en fous. C'est un cauchemar et je ne tiens plus tout. Je t'écris un message que tu ne liras pas. J'ai ces sentiments que plus jamais tu ne croiras. Tu m'aimes encore, personne ne le sait. Dis-moi que j'ai tort. Si tu regrettes, tu n'as qu'un mot à dire. À ta place, je ne serais pas les seuls. Je t'aime et je te hais, je déteste, je t'aime. Je ne veux pas, mais je ne sais pas aimer un autre que toi. Je t'aime et je te hais, je déteste t'aimer. Tu la trouves si belle, mais je ne serai jamais elle. Et moi je t'observe la regarder, comme la seule femme que tu n'aies jamais vue. Tu t'en fous de ce que ça me fait. Pour moi tes yeux n'ont jamais autant brillé. Et moi je t'observe la regarder, comme la plus belle chose que t'aies jamais vue. Comment ne remarques-tu pas que ça me tue à chaque fois? Je t'aime et je te hais, je déteste t'aimer. Je ne veux pas, mais je ne sais pas aimer un autre que toi. Je t'aime et je te hais, je déteste t'aimer. Tu la trouves si belle, mais je ne serai jamais elle. Tu me manques et je ne dors pas, juste après un café quand je ne peux plus manger. Tu manques et tu n'es pas là. Je me souviens de ces nuits blanches où l'on rêvait. Penses-tu qu'on se manque autant? Où que j'aille, je te vois pourtant. Les amis se font mal parfois. Et je suis fatigué, mais jamais de toi. Je pourrais tout faire pour toi, mais ça, tu t'en fous. C'est un cauchemar et je ne tiens plus tout. Je t'écris un
Okay,
message,
colleagues,
ces sentiments que plus jamais tu ne
friends, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to start the day with all of you. I'm a bit by myself here around the table, but ministers, presidents, distinguished panelists, and all those present in the room and online, you're most welcome. This side event is to touch base after the Paris summit for a new global financing pact. Probably many of you attended or followed. So it's titled From Paris to Cartagena and Nairobi, Public Development Bank's Response to the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact. And so we have a set of panelists that will give us their views, perception, recommendations, criticism. I mean, the idea is really to move forward. And I think for those of you that were present, there was a sense of urgency, a sense of openness, and hopefully a nice momentum that was born in Paris, and that we certainly have the responsibility here in Cartagena to strengthen structure, move forward. To sum up what happened in Paris in a nutshell, it was really about many heads of state, about 40. Prime Minister Motley was there, of course. Minister Schron, following the Bridgetown agenda. President Petro was there, also very, very active also in the summit. President Ramaphosa, the Prime Minister of China, members of the BRICS club, Leslie, were also President Lula, of course, and I don't want to forget Chancellor Scholz, Secretary Yellen. So the idea was really to keep multilateral active, and it was really about a new consensus, a new narrative. No country should have to choose between fighting poverty and fighting for the planet, and about country ownership of transition strategy. And of course, the idea of factoring in the architecture, the instruments, the question of vulnerability beyond poverty, and the question of inequalities was high in the discussion, and we were beyond, I would say, we were talking about international investments and solidarity, but way beyond the old framework of ODA. So something here, as we all know, is emerging that is still somehow unclear, and I hope the summit helped on this first dimension, which is a new narrative. The second part of the discussion between leaders and all the stakeholders in Paris was really about new ambition and new instruments. So, Cédric, we discussed a lot about infrastructure financing, green infrastructure, what is missing to increase the flows and the quality of the investments. We talked a lot about natural capital, the mobilization of private finance mandate, I think, is also beginning to be clearer for our institution. A lot also on new resources, especially innovative financing, like this idea of a levy on the maritime sector for climate, but also to unlock more resources for international cooperation. And a lot was addressed to finance in common, notably this coalition about climate risks and catastrophic event. Diego, Mr. Vice Minister, you were there yesterday to discuss it. This idea of contingent clauses, contingent financing, so that countries facing these extreme events are not trapped because of a fiscal space that is no longer available during the crisis. So a lot of discussions about financial innovation. So that's the second dimension. And the third was, of course, to help emerge a new architecture, a new global financial architecture. So a lot of attention was put on well, the Bretton Woods institution, especially the World Bank with its new president in Paris, and the MDB's reform. So there's a specific text that was approved by, I think, more than 50 countries on MDB reform. That is certainly Leslie will tell us, guiding now what is happening in this group. But FIX was also part of this thinking about a new architecture. So of course MDB is playing their role as multilateral players, but in a larger landscape where national, local public development banks are also part of the effort towards well, financing what nobody's financing, and mobilizing all willing stakeholders for sustainability and sustainable finance. So in a nutshell, these are the blocks probably that are coming from this summit. Specific ask for finance in common actually in the roadmap, very precise, that was published at the end of the summit. And the idea, of course, is to contribute, to feed in the other international events happening, not only Finance in Common, but the Nairobi summit that is happening right now, this Africa Climate Week and this African Climate Summit that is so important, including for this new narrative, reconciling climate and development. And of course, we know the timeline with the G20, UN General Assembly, and the SDG Summit, Marrakesh, Dubai, all the replenishment, dear Alvaro, of IFAD in December. So we hope that what was born at leaders level in June will have consequences over time in each and every of these meetings. President Macron announced that in 2025, of course, closely connected with COP30 in Belém, we will take stock of the results of this movement, and probably need to do more then for success of our endeavor. So this is where we are, and the idea beyond this introduction was really from various stakeholders to have your views. And of course, this is an ongoing process. So also how to direct, orient, guide to make to have the best possible result. So we will divide this side event in which will last 1 hour in 2 parts. So first we will listen to key stakeholders. Rosalind McKenna, you're the senior advisor at Open Society Foundation. So maybe you could share with us the view of the philanthropic community that is strong here in Cartagena. Your take and what you expect from this movement. For the sake of time, maybe from 3 to 5 minutes, if it's okay for you, for each of you. Thank you, Rosalind.
Thank you, Remy, and thank you for the invitation to this session, and also to the FIC Secretariat and the hosts in Colombia for organising this event. From Open Society Foundation's perspective, I mean, some may wonder why a foundation traditionally known for work on governance and human rights and democratic protections is so focused on this question of finance. And frankly, I think there's a recognition, which was aligned with Paris, that finance and the quality of finance really is the bedrock upon which we will build democratic protection and deliver for populations. And I think it also speaks to why we were so interested in participating in and supporting the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact. This sense that there is a moment to bring agendas together, and also to combine both the technical and the political elements of this challenge in order to deliver the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the biodiversity framework. To reflect on the philanthropic statement from Paris, I think important to pick up some of the elements of that. A recognition as philanthropy that we needed to engage in systems change, not isolated solutions, to engage with policymakers and institutional stakeholders to deliver locally led projects and programs, to leverage private finance for greater impact, and that would include philanthropic resources, but not only philanthropic, and then to think about how we scale support to deliver on government priorities. So while there's a range of institutional players in this space, how do we deliver government priorities for their populations? So just quickly to maybe flag two of the areas where I think philanthropy sees an opportunity to support this agenda. The first is on this question of funding innovations, recognising that philanthropy has a different risk profile than many other funders in this space, with the constraints of domestic and political considerations at home. And then also, I think, to look at the operating environment within which many of these reforms will take place. So quickly to touch on one of the innovations that Gates, Open Society Foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation have been supporting is an MDB Challenge Fund. To say we have the recommendations from the Capital Advocacy Framework Review, and yet we see that different elements of that are facing different obstacles. So the MDB Challenge Fund is supporting development banks, think tanks, academics, the private sector to look at how can you pilot implementation of some of the CAF recommendations in a way that could then be replicated across other development banks. So I think many of you heard Jean from the Caribbean Development Bank yesterday speak of the work around climate contingent clauses that has been supported by the Challenge Fund. I'm delighted to say this week we have finalised support to IDB for their sustainable finance platform on multi-country guarantees. And I think this question of guarantees is something that philanthropy needs to look at more closely. As Open Society Foundations, we've had a good record of working, for example, with the COVAX mechanism to put a guarantee in place to backstop some risk control for countries procuring vaccines so that bilateral donor resources didn't have to be utilised for that backstop resource. So this question of guarantees, I think, something we could explore further. But I do want to touch on, and I'll finish on this question, around the political environment. What is politically feasible of the technical solutions? OSF, Gates, Rockefeller, Ford, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation are working to support a global recovery collective to really surge some of the campaigning, advocacy communications to make the case for this funding. Similarly, working with Minister Strawn's colleagues in Barbados, we're engaging with the Bridgetown Initiative, with the Africa High-Level Working Group on the Global Financial Architecture, with the V20 to think about how we support cohorts of political leaders to take forward this agenda. And finally, this question of public support. Open Society Foundations, in advance of UNGA, will next week publish new data on the level of public support for a range of issues. 76% of that polling cohort in 30 countries, representing around 5 billion of the world's population, 76% support an increase in overseas development assistance, including the majority of G7 countries. 68% support high-income countries providing greater capital to the World Bank. The public support is there, but there's an opportunity, I think, for philanthropy as a follow-on from Paris to think about how do we support, catalyse, build the public support that frankly provides the political coverage so that we can deliver on Paris, on Nairobi, on Cartagena. So I will leave it there, but we look forward to hearing more on how we support this agenda. Thank you, Remy.
Thanks a lot, Rosaline. I think it resonates strongly in the community here, especially yes, all the work on innovation and the challenge fund you were referring to. So we were more on the liability side or the financing side. Maybe I can turn to Cédric Van Riel. You're the director of operations at Source, and so you're more on the asset side. And we know that financial innovation is helpful, but we need way more quality bankable projects. And so the issue of concrete preparation of projects was also high on the agenda. Please, Cédric.
And good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to the AFD for the invitation to the summit and also the support from the MDBs to enable our presence today in this beautiful city of Cartagena. Indeed, Source, for just introducing briefly, is a digital solution led and financed by the MDBs to support countries to develop their infrastructure projects including all the best practices and also including the objective to reach the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreements. And it's a global platform, but then that can be adapted to the country's context, thanks to the support and technical finance provided by MDBs and donors. So it was identified at the Paris Summit as one of the quick win and recommendation. So from there, and thanks to the summit in Paris, we mobilized 5 million euro from the European Commission, the Asian Development Bank, and the Agence Française de Développement to continue our work, as we are doing now in 13 countries. So we are providing this digital tool and ongoing technical assistance to 9 countries. We completed the process in 3, and 1 is currently on hold for reason. And then basically what is important for us to be here is to continue to provide this tool, because we have 40 countries waiting to receive our technical assistance, to beneficiate from this public goods hosted by the United Nations that support the mobilization of private finance by providing better understanding of what is the key information needed at each project step, and making sure that the right data is collected ex ante and ex post to have, among all, better alignment with different standards and best practices, including, for example, the fast infra label put together by private banks, but also, among others, the standards from the G20, the QII indicators, also other methodologies from the United Nations, the UNEC, the peers methodology. So avoiding double data entry, so having one platform for governments to both evaluate their project against their national standards and national methodology, but also using the same data, enabling to evaluate their project against international standards. And we would like to continue this work also with national development banks. We are already engaged on the side of the National Development Bank of Ecuador, for example, also in South Africa, to better connect projects, infrastructure projects from the subnational level to have better connection with technical assistance provided by the MDBs and international organization, and also to have this project link into the systems of the national development banks, so they can also evaluate them, provide assistance, and then this project can also be screened, evaluated, prioritized by the national level from the Ministry of Finance perspective, or PPP units in some cases. So in a nutshell, very glad to be part of this summit, and looking forward to reinforce our collaboration with all the key stakeholders to gain more collaboration and best practices from all of you, because you are the organization setting up the scene and providing of this knowledge and this technical assistance. And for us, just keep integrating this digital tool in more countries that are waiting in line to work with us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cédric. And thanks to both of you. I think these two introductory interventions demonstrate what's happening. I mean, this connection between philanthropists and public banks, which is quite new, and also these innovative tools to accompany the governments on infrastructure and greening the infrastructure, and a key tool to mobilize private finance, because it gives transparency, it gives opportunities, and it helps make projects bankable. So these were discussed actually with leaders. So then that was also the interest of the summit in Paris. It was at the same time highly political and very technical, somehow in a mix of interventions. So thanks to both of you. I will now turn to our panel. We have Alvaro Lario, the president of IFAD. I will give him the floor first. Then, of course, our Colombian host, Sandra Villardi, you're the Vice Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development, and Diego Guevara, you are the Deputy Minister of Finance. And so you will share with us your experience and also the work that is ongoing on debt, nature and climate after the summit, led by Colombia. We have also Minister Ryan Strong, you're the Minister of Finance of Barbados. We are extremely honored to have you here, and we commend the leadership of your country and your Prime Minister way before the Paris Summit and way beyond. Certainly, you will give us your remarks, and then we will close by a veteran of public development banks, our dear friend Leslie Masdorp from the New Development Bank, a few days after the BRICS Summit, to have your views. I forgot to say in my introduction that Paris was particularly important for the Finance in Common movement. As probably you know, we had a specific meeting with 5 heads of state, Président Petro, Président Talon of Benin, Président Ramaphosa, President Diaz-Canel of Cuba, President Macron, and we had all the multilateral development banks, and we had the national development banks, notably of the heads of state present in the room, so that they saw before them what we are talking about here in terms of scale, in terms of architecture, and the way they could leverage our combined capacity. So please, in your intervention, give us your take on the summit and what's ahead of us, but also maybe what it means more specifically for this forum, this initiative we are building all together. So first, Alvaro, please, you're special, of course, because you're specialized in agriculture, food security, you're a public bank, you're a UN agency, so you can give us a good synthesis of what's happening, please.
Thank you very much, Remy, and thank you for the invitation. Indeed, I was reflecting on some of your takeaways. I participated in some of the events in Paris, and it's difficult to actually summarize because there were a lot of things that came out. And I will comment a little bit on what you just mentioned as the outcomes and the reflections and how it links to FICS and to agriculture. So it was very much needed to have a new narrative. Over the last year, 12 months, 18 months, what we have seen is that the geopolitical fracture and the financial fracture has been increasing. We've seen increased uncertainty, obviously after COVID and what happened in the Ukraine war. The mistrust and the lack of trust had been increasing. We are seeing also inflation going up, interest rates going up, fiscal space being much lower for many of the countries, migration also increasing. For the first time in the last 2-3 decades, we've seen poverty also coming back. So the number of people who have fallen into poverty and food insecurity have increased by 150 million. So in this sense, this is the political context and the financial context. So we needed to have a window open, and I think Paris provided that window. The outcomes, obviously, and when you talk about what are the outcomes and people ask you, they cannot obviously solve all of these issues in one matter, but it opens some hope and some opportunities. Specifically, perhaps on the Bretton Woods evolution, 1 year ago or 18 months ago, we were not discussing many of these issues. We were not discussing some of the possibilities. So thanks to the Bridgetown initiatives and some of the, I would say, support from some of the countries that has been at the top of the agenda. However, for the time being, it's true that this is just an initial discussion. If we talk about the core issues, and some of them I'm sure Leslie will talk about, we see still, or at least from our side, being a concessional fund, there's issues related to grant financing vis-a-vis concessional financing. Many of the low-income countries are highly indebted. They do not have the capacity to actually borrow, much less for the rural poor, for example. And that creates basically the need to find ways of making sure that these countries, the low-income, in the sense of the really poverty going up and food insecurity going up, how are we going to support them and help them? The same goes with middle income countries and climate financing and the financing of global public goods. So this cost of grants versus concessional finance is at the core, I would say, of the discussions of the link of politics and finance. Then we have other, perhaps more technical, but it's dollar debt versus local currency financing, which has been on the table for some time. There's, for example, the volume, which we have seen ways of trying to stretch further for balance sheet, but it goes beyond volume, I would say. Then you have other more technical matters, which, for example, Leslie has written about on the AAA versus a AA plus, which doesn't seem to be on the table for some of the MDBs. So there's a lot of matters, but I would say, to me, the core goes to this high indebtedness and little fiscal capacity of many of the countries, as well as the financing of global public financial goods. Then going a little bit more in depth into, up to recently we had the two different narratives, one on climate, one on food security or poverty. Now they are very much interlinked, and I think this has been recognized by as Remy was saying, not having to choose between development or getting your people still having the ability of adapting to climate finance. And specifically, perhaps to finalize, I mean, I think this link for us between humanitarian and development, as well as the role of FIX, is fundamental. Specifically to agriculture, for the first time after 20 years, we're seeing some early negotiations or discussions at the World Trade Organization in terms of the, I would say, 600 billion of taxes and subsidies that there are out there in terms of food security and food systems. We're seeing now, obviously, interesting developments at the G20 that I will be attending this weekend in terms of also the importance of food security and poverty in all of these matters. And in terms of PDBs, perhaps very briefly, I would say the focus on food systems transformation is key. Imagine if we would just get 10% of that 2.5 trillion into food security, that would clearly support the food systems transformation, increase local production, increased, I would say, integration of regional markets. And for the first time, we're seeing leaders outside Europe and outside the US looking at food security as national security. If you think about how this has been the global architecture in terms of food for the last decades, obviously Europe and the US had it at the center and at the core, but many of the other countries around the world have not. And that created the vulnerability we are seeing right now in terms of how they import and export. Just one figure, if you think about Africa, I mean, they import every year 60, 70 billion of food. Imagine what type of jobs you could create if you could just bring that back into the transformation and the processing in Africa. So we have the solutions, we have the institutions. I would not want to comment on further funds, further institutions. That's not what we need. We need to find the ways of the current solutions and instruments to scale them up, to try to make ways of operating for PDBs, for private sector to join, and to make sure that we do not forget the most vulnerable, and those many times are in the rural poor. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alvaro. I now turn to our Colombian hosts. So Sandra and Diego, your turn. You start.
Thank you very much, Remy. It's a pleasure to be here. Basically, when you are in a Ministry of Finance, I think that the main challenge in our times is how we're going to face the increasing debt after the pandemic, and at the same time how we are going to address resources for the energetic transition, and at the same time how we are going to finance all the climate action. And basically the growing debt burdens could be difficult for many developing countries in order to achieve all the sustainable development goals, and at the same time how we are going to achieve our NDC. I think that probably this is the main difficulty for countries of low income and also for countries of middle income. There are some important data that I would like to bring here to the table, and is that around the majority of climate finance, around 71%, is provided mainly toward mitigation channels, and still we are not thinking in terms of adaptation and debt, something that we were talking yesterday, the ex-ante logics that we should address. And at the same time after time, we are having an increasing level of debt, unless in the last 10 years, around 54% is the level of debt that is growing in developing countries. So I think that it's an important point, and at the same time, probably is the main reason to be here. How we can try to break the vicious circle of finance and try to move to the virtuous cycle. I think that we cannot commit the mistake to bring the financialization logics to the climate finance. I think that it's something that we should pay attention, and we need new mechanisms, and I think that is one of the main points that we are going to discuss here. Even there are some recent experience that we're here in South America in terms of debt and climate management. I think that, for example, the case of Ecuador, that it's a recent example. However, we think that was a process that was complex. The transaction cost was also high, around $10 million of US, and it took a lot of time, 2 years. And when we are addressing all these challenges regarding climate change, 2 years could be a long time. So basically, we need to move fast in this order of ideas. So basically, in this context, and I think that Colombia and also Kenya, where as Remy said before, they are running right now another summit there. I think that this is the idea of a new global financial pact, and basically, probably the first step that we should follow this year is how we're going to start to have these independent global experts. I think that probably most of you here have the technical capacity for that. We are having some meetings in this summit in order to try to invite some experts for this panel, and our President Gustavo Petro, often he's bringing to all the international conference the idea how we are going to change debt for climate action, that it's something that Colombia and the region wants to be a leader. I think that it's important from this point of view. And I think that from this point of view, it's important to talk about climate justice in terms of new financial architecture, how we are going to talk about global taxes in order to achieve this new idea. And just to finish, I think that probably an important aspect here is that we should talk about concessional financing. Basically, we should talk about concessional financing and have a strategy that should be compatible with long-term sustainable development. At the same time, something that probably Rosa said before, how we are going to unlock the potential of SDR. During the pandemic, probably there are still some space of SDR from some developed countries, and probably we could have a new allocation for SDR in order to respond to ongoing global crisis. I think that we need to be more flexible when we are going to discuss about SDR. And just to finish, I think that it's important to talk about the idea of the global public good. Basically, places as the Amazonian jungle or the Pacific, we need a new approach for the economic valuation of these strategic ecosystems when we are going to talk about how is going to be the response for this in this scenario of the new global financial pact. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego. Sandra, your comments?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning for all. I speak in Spanish, please. Thank you. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación para que podamos dialogar sobre este tema. Y sin duda creo que no podemos olvidar que estamos ante una de las crisis más inminentes y uno de los mayores desafíos de la humanidad. Eso debe ser la sombrilla en la que nos reúne la conversación. Y por lo tanto, poder dimensionar los efectos de la triple crisis, la crisis climática, la crisis de biodiversidad y la crisis de contaminación y sus retroalimentaciones, es un imperativo para todos los países y para toda la comunidad global. Estamos teniendo avances diferenciales. Sabemos un poco más sobre los efectos de la crisis climática Y este año en particular vamos a tener unas cifras aterradoras sobre daños y pérdidas en un año en donde batimos todos los récords de aumentos de temperatura. Sobre la crisis de biodiversidad sabemos mucho menos. Los expertos del panel intergubernamental de biodiversidad y servicios ecosistémicos nos han ido ayudando a entender la dinámica de la crisis. Tenemos reportes como, por ejemplo, el reporte del Foro Económico Mundial, en donde nos dice que la mitad del Producto Interno Bruto mundial depende de la biodiversidad y está en riesgo por la pérdida de biodiversidad, pero aún no hemos logrado enlazar biodiversidad y clima. Hemos aproximado algo cuando hablamos de adaptación, mitigación basado en soluciones basadas en la naturaleza y restauración. Ahí confluyen las agendas, pero sigue siendo insuficiente ante la magnitud de la crisis. Cada año seguimos perdiendo hectáreas de biodiversidad, cada año seguimos perdiendo arrecifes de coral, los incendios forestales están arrasando de manera acelerada y devastadora la biodiversidad. Así que es muy importante que podamos desde el sector financiero poder tener claro lo que eso está significando y lo que eso significa para los países, especialmente los países de renta media y baja, que están muy asociados a las zonas de mayor biodiversidad. Y entonces, cuando podemos entender la biodiversidad como un capital acumulado que puede generar dividendos, nos podría ayudar a abrir una ventana de innovaciones financieras. ¿Qué es lo que necesitamos? Porque lo que estamos hoy en día viviendo y estamos utilizando en el sector financiero, pues a todas luces es insuficiente para enfrentar la crisis. Acabamos de salir de la crisis del COVID, que nos permitió generar soluciones innovadoras a una escala temporal muy rápida. Tuvimos acuerdos mundiales para la que necesitamos de manera importante avanzar en esto. Y una de las dimensiones asociadas al espacio, a las soluciones financieras, tiene que ver efectivamente, como lo mencionaban hace un rato, el espacio fiscal y la deuda. Sin duda necesitamos hablar de esto. Necesitamos hablar con las calificadoras de riesgo, necesitamos hablar de manera innovadora y creativa, y por eso en París los presidentes crearon esta iniciativa del grupo de expertos internacionales sobre deuda, clima y naturaleza. Necesitamos explorarlo, necesitamos poner las cartas sobre la mesa y buscar mecanismos para entender la capacidad de reacción. En la medida que el tiempo pase y la crisis aumente, la pérdida de biodiversidad estará más retroalimentada por la crisis climática y estaremos perdiendo oportunidades de poder reaccionar. Si podemos invertir rápidamente en fortalecer y ampliar el capital natural para no solamente enfrentar la crisis climática, sino desarrollar otro tipo de oportunidades de servicios y necesidades que va a necesitar la humanidad en estos tiempos de crisis climática, podemos tener mecanismos interesantes. Pero necesitamos un tiempo de innovación institucional, necesitamos hablar de clima y de deuda, de clima y de naturaleza. Este mensaje, como ustedes lo escucharon hace un rato, lo está llevando también la señora vicepresidenta Francia Márquez y la señora ministra Susana Muhammad en el African Climate Summit, y los invitamos a escuchar más tarde, en la tarde, una propuesta un poco más detallada sobre una idea del plan Marshall para el clima. El presidente Petro nos invita a eso, a que pensemos en fortalecer el capital natural como una posibilidad para combinar la deuda y las finanzas. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And yes, we're following closely what is happening in Nairobi, and we'll try to cross-reference the two summits. Of course, this is the one and single effort ongoing. Minister Strand from Barbados, I give you the floor. How do you see this process and reform from your perspective?
Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome from our Prime Minister from Barbados. And I want to thank our host here for a very wonderful series of presentations so far. As I reflect on what our panelists have spoken on so far for the morning, I think it is safe to say that speed and scale is the order of the day. And to the extent that we have been able to forge what I believe is a accelerated consensus on how to move forward, the key for us in Barbados and certainly small states really comes down to how quickly can we ourselves execute, build capacity, but working clearly with international partners to deliver, because as a small country, faced with all of the challenges that we're facing globally, with the uncertainty, we must make sure that we deliver for our citizens and deliver quickly. And that must be in a very clearly articulated fashion from policy that makes sense for them. Now, I listened to Diego, I listened to Sandra, and it's important to understand that the finance and the environment must be on the same page to move ahead. And I'm happy to see you both here in the same space, because when I started this journey 5 years ago, there were separate conversations taking place. And I think that this initiative clearly shows that there is we have begun to turn the corner in terms of being able to come together, but now the time is really about speed. Now, if any of you know anything about Barbados, you will know that boldness is part of our DNA. And we have been driving this process because it is important to understand that there really should not be a choice between development and being able to save your people. And for us, as a small island developing state, that is absolutely key, because we've been able to invest in strong social policy for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And we need to be able to accelerate that in a way that allows our citizens equal access to everything that is available globally. And therefore, it is important that we work collaboratively with multilateral banks to be able to see how we can fashion said solutions. Now, one of the things that I'm happy about is that there seems to be clear consensus about having natural disaster clauses in our debt and the like, and we fully support that. But I can tell you, none of our citizens want to actually experience a disaster to get relief from debt service. And I want to make that point clear. So whilst we support the idea strongly, the reality is that after a devastating event, there's trauma, and therefore the focus, we believe, has to be on how do we build resilience upfront, quickly, such that when the event happens, the impact is as minimally disruptive as possible. So therefore, in a financing conversation, the question is, how do we proactively create a framework that allows us to almost automatically trigger the clauses to build the resilience upfront, because it costs more to rebuild after the event than if you were to put in the necessary resilience measures upfront. And I believe that the work with the public development banks is going to be important for carrying that conversation forward, because we would rather spend the next 2-3 years, as we are doing, crafting our climate action plan to respond to build resilience in a way that allows countries to actually do two things. You build the resilience, but also you equally respond to the SDG challenge, which we all face. And I think yesterday we admitted that we are a little behind with respect to being able to achieve that. So I see the response to the climate crisis and the way that we finance it by being able to trigger those clauses in a coordinated way that allows countries to build that resilience upfront. And therefore, working together, we can mobilize the resources within the context of the private sector. We are working this year on a debt for climate swap with the IDB and the European Investment Bank, following on from a debt for nature swap that we did last year. But the reality is, in crafting our climate action plan, it needs to be financed. And I'm not saying that that's the only way to finance it, because there's a range of things to do. But the reality is, if we are able to coordinate properly and allow countries to access those resources that we will free up, so to speak, after a crisis, I know that that would be a much better way for us to accelerate the implementation of our plans and allow us to be able to meet those 2030 goals in the way that we are not able to do so now. So I'll leave it there for the moment, but I think we have to find concrete steps to be able to say, this is the plan, this is how we're going to support it, and therefore mobilize the resources along those plans in order to build the resilience that we know that we can do. Thank you very much.
Very clear. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Minister. I now turn to our last panelist, Leslie. The new development bank is special. Of course, you're the public bank of the BRICS group, now expanding significantly. You're also this year the chair of the group of MDBs, so you have this coordinating multilateral duty, and thanks a lot in Paris during you fully joined the Finance in Common movement. So your view on what's the architecture is about scale and speed, as the minister said it, is particularly important. Please.
Thank you very much, Remy, for the opportunity. I think my colleagues have already covered a fair bit of the themes. Let me just start out by just flagging again a point that Alvaro made with respect to the geopolitics. And I'd like to start with the BRICS summit, which just concluded in South Africa. As we know, we had over 40 heads of state attend. And it's very important to just flag that, nowhere in the Johannesburg Declaration would you see anything about BRICS wanting to position itself as an anti-West formation. Nowhere is there any mention of the words of de-dollarization and so on. We just live in an era now of sort of fractured politics, and we should guard against this kind of increasing fragmentation. I think BRICS is an addition to the multilateral system. It's now becoming, if you like, a permanent feature of the geopolitical sort of landscape. So this idea that it is been set up as a counterweight is something that we should dispel. The increasing use of local currency financing, which Alvaro and others touched on, is a core element of the new development bank. It does not mean that the institution will move away from the US dollar as the core anchor currency of our operations and in which we finance our activities. The next point I'd like to make, as you've already highlighted, I think there's now a very high degree of consensus around what constitutes the reform agenda for MDBs. We await with interest now the second report of the G20 MDB expert group. The first report, called Triple Agenda, is a major addition to the reform process because it sets out and it quantifies what is the sort of ambition over the next number of years up to 2030. As you know, the intent is to increase sustainable lending volumes coming from MDBs threefold. As Rosalind has already touched on, as well as Alvaro, financing is at the heart of making this work. One of the more difficult elements of the report, though, is the single sentence which says that they've come to the inescapable conclusion that a general capital increase will be necessary. And Janet Yellen and the other ministers from the developed world in Ahmedabad at the G20 finance ministers, immediately sort of latched onto that component. So I don't think we're likely going to see consensus over this coming weekend from the G20 on the report. But in general, I think the report will be welcomed in terms of setting out the agenda of what needs to be done. I think it's also important to highlight that the report flags the importance of leveraging the MDB system. And I think, in that regard, the appointment of a new president of the World Bank coming in with fresh ideas and fresh energy is going to give impetus to the, Finance in Commons movement, which is all about leveraging of the complementarities of the system, us working together in more imaginative ways. So I think there is still a lot more that is required in terms of the toolkit, in terms of how we're going to tap into additional financing. All of the MDBs are now looking at ways of leveraging the opportunity to raise hybrid capital, which is something that the rating agencies have now formally endorsed as part of they change their methodologies, if you like, to accommodate us raising hybrid capital. The discussion continues also about recycling of SDRs. There's no consensus yet, but the IMF is still sort of talking about that. So the unresolved part of the MDB reform agenda is really the invigorating the toolkit and finding new opportunities to inject fresh capital within the MDB system. In short, we believe, having engaged with all the MDBs over the last year, that we probably have the best opportunity now to reform the development finance architecture. And part of that reform is indeed the more, a better, if you like, engagement between your multilateral banks and your national development banks, who play a very critical role in terms of especially the local currency financing agenda within member countries. In short, it's unlikely that Marrakesh will take us substantially forward, because we've just heard in the last week or so, Remy, that it's unlikely that the second report of the MDB panel will be ready by the time Marrakesh happens, which means that we'll have to wait for the G20 going into Brazil next year as a lead. And President Goldfein is here from IDB. They will be taking over the chair, so hopefully there'll be fresh impetus given to that financing agenda. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Leslie, and to all of you. I'm not sure we can open a discussion with the room. I don't know if do we have time for one or two questions or comments from the room, or I try to conclude this discussion, or not conclude. Sorry, you are behind me.
Behind you.
Please, can you present yourself?
I'm Jamie Coates. I'm with Wise Responder, created by Oxford University to bring multidimensional property technology to companies. My question is for Diego and Sandra. Colombia is the world-leading country in the use of multidimensional poverty. President Petro has made it a central part of your government plan. Has Colombia thought about taking the leadership that you already have to the development banks to use multidimensional poverty? So when people say climate justice, okay, we can measure climate, but how do you measure justice? Colombia is doing an amazing job, and I was particularly interested in Diego's talking about a public good. Can we make poverty zero a public good with Colombia's knowledge? Thank you.
Thank you. I can take a second question and then close. Is there someone else?
Sí, hablaron sobre que hasta ahorita hay un aumento en la pobreza, aumentó la pobreza de un tiempo para acá en 150 millones de personas, supongo que a nivel mundial. Pero yo lo que pregunto es de que si han visto que el sistema de mercado, el sistema de mercantilización de todos los ámbitos de la vida de la gente no ha servido para sacar a las personas de la pobreza a nivel mundial. ¿Por qué insisten en ese camino? Ahora hay un proyecto, hay una coalición por el Amazonas. En mi pueblo están metiendo más energía renovable cuando nos ha empobrecido. Están varios sistemas de comunicación para hacer corredores energéticos en América Latina, y en mi región está el corredor interoceánico del Istmo de Tehuantepec y el Tren Maya, que está deforestando selvas, bosques. Todo eso está deforestando, está contaminando el agua, está acabando con la soberanía alimentaria o la seguridad alimentaria de los pueblos. Y aquí yo no veo que haya una inclusión. Yo oigo que solamente los bancos hablan y los gobiernos. ¿Y dónde está el pueblo? Dicen que tiene que ser transparente, dice que tienen que eliminar los riesgos. Si quieren eliminar los riesgos, yo digo que tienen que hablar primero con la gente. ¿Qué es lo que necesitamos nosotros? Y también se habla de que ha habido, somos vulnerables y somos pobres, pero no ven dónde subyace esa pobreza y esa vulnerabilidad que ha sido del despojo de todos nuestros bienes naturales que históricamente han estado en estos territorios que se dicen del primer mundo. Entonces, si no se ve eso, entonces ¿por qué seguir en esa misma dinámica? Eso es lo que yo pregunto, porque yo vengo de esos territorios despojados, esos territorios lastimados, esos territorios donde nos persiguen por defender nuestra tierra y nuestra vida. Entonces yo quiero preguntar eso, ¿por qué se continúa en esa dinámica frenética de mercantilización de la vida, de la naturaleza y de todo? Eso es lo que yo quiero preguntar, si no hay buenos resultados, y ustedes mismos lo dicen. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Maybe Diego or Sandra could take the first question, because it's really about Colombian public policies. And I don't know, maybe Alvaro or Leslie, because it was more a question to our institutions and the way we do business. And do we pay enough attention to communities and territories in the way we operate? And in the end, what is exactly the model we have in mind in terms of sustainable development? Please, Diego.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. As you said before, Colombia has been a leader in terms of poverty action here in the DMP, or the National Developing Department. In the last 10 years, I think maybe a bit more, we have been successful in terms of using the multidimensional poverty in order to structure all the policy. I think that the cash transfer policy in Colombia has been successful in terms of using the multidimensional poverty index. We have conditional cash transfer that takes many of the results that we have from this index. Maybe when I try to talk about public good or global public good, it's related about the Amazon or the Pacific, that it doesn't matter, it is just part of the Colombian or the Brazilian territory. It should be a commitment from all around the world with these public goods that at the end of the day are going to be highly valuable in the present and in the near future. Maybe your idea to try to address poverty zero as a public good in terms of local objective, it's really important. Actually, here in our government, one of the main challenges is hunger zero. I think that we started 1 year ago with this government. With this program, we have faced still some challenge in some areas, because they'll say in the urban Colombia, cash transfer has worked really good, but there are some specific areas where maybe we need different strategies, but in order to achieve zero poverty. So thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Alvaro.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very important question. I would say what Remy said, what's the mission of many of our institutions. In Latin America, you said food insecurity has increased because of the crisis from 31% to 37%. And I think this is just not acceptable in many of the economies, which are middle-income economies. I'll speak a little bit about IFAD. IFAD, I mean, it's a very inclusive institution. We're community-driven, last and mile. We work with farmers' organizations, with youth associations, with indigenous peoples. From our side, this is the type of development I believe in. I used to work also in the private sector of an MDB, and in the private sector, I can see the impact, and many times we can acknowledge that in development, we focus very much on the big infrastructure and not as much on the last and mile or the poverty, which is in the rural areas. However, on the positive side, I must say that lately I've been meeting with a lot of the MDB heads, and they are very much more wanting to see what's the impact on the ground, how can they link that bigger infrastructure into the impact of the communities. It's still a big change of what happened, to be frank, over the last decade, so that has been a change, and we'll see whether we'll get there. Perhaps one example of what you were mentioning, I was recently in Brazil, and BNDES for the first time invested with us, with a UN agency, in 9 states in the Northeast, where actually most of the poverty is, on climate adaptation, and going from, I mean, it's impacting 1 million people, and I was visiting many of them. And here we can say also the importance of not only talking about subsistence farming, but actually commercial and small-scale commercial. It's important that these people have the opportunities, the jobs, and a way of having a decent living wage. So it's, I would say, commercial and how to link it to markets is also important, and certainly climate adaptation, and especially, for example, in Brazil, where there's the only biome, the Caatinga, that they have in the northeast, is fundamental, because they have issues with water scarcity and other matters, arid land. So it's important to work with the communities, as well as seeing how many of our institutions can support these poor people, which actually many times are not in the big conversation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alvaro. Before concluding, let me expand on what you're just saying. Thank you, Madam. I mean, civil society and the questions you raised, they've been part of the Finance in Common place movement from day one. We're very proud to have civil society as part of the governance, the executive committee of Finance in Common. And yes, I think all our institution is in the process of revising the way we're doing our business to better take care of what you are referring to. Just an information, we as I'm the head of the French Development Agency, AFD, and we're proud to be partner here in Colombia of a fascinating festival that is called Actuar por el Vivo. Act for the Living, Agir pour le Vivant. It's an initiative that also deploys itself in Cameroon to explore this dimension in Africa and also in France. It's a place where we meet with financial institutions or firms, meet with artists, meet with intellectuals, researchers about this issue of climate and biodiversity and the way they transform our models, basically, and which is not only about economics, it's also about politics, it's also about arts, it's also about science. It's organized with a local partner that is Confama. It's in Medellin every year, and this is the place where, for instance, I had the chance to meet with anthropologist Arturo Escobar. So people that are really thinking about what development means, what sustainable development means, what is this new consensus, maybe certainly very different from the old framework. That is still our common mandate, for sure. So if FIX can be a place also, and I invite other banks to join that type of work, because we have a concrete residence work to work on post-development, I would say, in this setting. I think this is also part of what we're doing here. I have to conclude. I think we could talk about it for years. Just to share with all participants, of course, our thanks to the panelists. That was very interesting to hear your various perspectives, and at the same time to feel Leslie said, I think the strong consensus that is progressively emerging between all of us, I would say despite or because or with our differences. The first point is I think we all agree that we need, it's about a system change, and for that we need to enlarge our thinking and ambition, breaking silos between climate and development, between international and national, and as Leslie rightfully said, avoid fragmentation, especially at the geopolitical level. So that's one. Second, it was very clear in the discussion that our banks and beyond, we probably have a twin mandate that we have to clarify. We have to protect and protect the most vulnerable and finance what nobody will finance. That's the core of our mission, and we need more resources for that. And I say vulnerable, which is not only the poorest. I mean, it's minister is the poorest, but also that those that are the most affected by what's happening in reality with climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So that's first mandate. And adaptation, loss and damage, there are many things happening here. But at the same time, we have to finance and implement global goods, global commons, everywhere, in each and every country in the world where we could reduce emissions. And this is probably where the mobilization of the private finance, private sector is so important. But as long as we try to have, in my personal view, one and single mandate like we had before, we're a bit lost. So really we have to distinguish more clearly this twin mandate that can guide. Of course, it's up to our shareholders and the governments to set the balance between the two in each and every bank member of finance in common. But in this large framework, probably there are two issues different. The third point is we need more quality and innovative financing. So that's for sure. In Paris, we said the 100 billion of SDR was achieved, which is a first step. Now, hopefully, we can make more innovative and leveraging use of this SDR. That's the proposal by the African Development Bank, IDB, and many multilateral development banks. We also succeeded in the implementation of the framework, the G20 framework for debt relief in the case of Zambia, and we know there are countries that will need debt relief over time, and the 100 billion of Copenhagen was not that far, probably back in Paris, but we know we have to do way more. We will announce here in Cartagena that the IDFC, the club I'm heading, has produced $288 billion US climate finance last year in 2022. So we are already, all of us, turning to climate and doing way more than what we did before the Paris summit, well, COP21 back in 2015, and a call, Rosalind, a strong call from every place to innovate and then to disseminate the innovations so that they can be scaled up. Last, I think it becomes more and more clear what the new architecture for this new consensus is about. The challenge is for it to be large and seamless, and at the same time be speedy enough and efficient. Minister, scale and speed and scale. It's certainly a challenge. The reform of the MDBs is absolutely crucial, and there's good progress here, as Leslie reminded us. But again, in the context of FIX and embarking, having traction on the rest of the architecture and the national development banks to have I would say, the first origination and the last mile for the big programs that I hope will be defined and supported by our government. So that's what I take. Of course, it's difficult. And I hope that we will capture that in the communiqué with your help of this very meeting, so that we can help our leaders and other stakeholders progressively go in the direction that is certainly needed, and with a very important deadline, probably in 2025, for this Paris movement that was born, and because it will be the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement in Belém with COP30, which is also the moment I was the negotiator where we have to set what climate finance is about 10 years after Paris. So again, if in the next 2 years FIX can be helpful for this agenda, I think we would have made a useful role collectively. On this, I close the meeting and invite all of you, of course, to continue on the sidelines. Thanks a lot.